Welcome to the Historical Movies Podcast, a podcast all about movies inspired by history. I'm Ross Evans, I'm an editor, and I'm joined by Professor of Modern History at Liverpool Hope University and historical scriptwriter Bryce Evans. Bryce, how are you?
Very good, very good.
And in this episode, Zulu, sir. Thousands of them. It's Zulu. Bryce, I thought for this episode, inspired by the film and the striking lack of diversity of surnames on this podcast, I'll be 593 Evans and you can be 716 Evans.
Okay, very good.
And actually, the first thing I've got to ask you is, did you actually, whilst watching this film, did you manage to pick out the Zulu with the wristwatch?
I didn't, and it led me to think, did I imagine that, or is it just an urban myth?
Well, I don't know. I always thought it was sort of the yardstick of historical anachronisms, isn't it? It's the kind of, it's always said, oh, this was anachronistic, just like the Zulu with the wristwatch, or at least it was for me when I was growing up. So I think it might be. I think it might actually be, as you say, not true.
There's a lot of other supposed bloopers in the movie, especially in the fighting scenes. Bayonets appearing and disappearing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, some of the fighting scenes, well, that leads us nicely on, because I was just thinking, this is the first time on this podcast we've done a classic film, and I was thinking, some of the fight scenes are some of them are crap, actually, just completely non-believable. But I was thinking this week, what is it about these type of movies that I love? If I had to pick my top 10 movies of all time, probably half of them would come from the 60s. And I was thinking, what is the thing about 60s movies that I love? And I came up with quite a long list. I won't go into all of it. But one of the things is the theatricality of it. They're so much more theatrical, these movies, than perhaps modern movies. The lighting, the colour even of the film, I think that's because this is when they started using Technicolor. So the way that they processed it, it kind of gives it a kind of a sort of bluey hue. The overacting, the over makeup, particularly Michael Caine is suffering from, he's just caked in makeup in this film. A lot of things like recording silently on location was a lot more common because of the limitations of the recording equipment. So then it's dubbed later in the studio. So that gives it another weird vibe where the audio sometimes is a little out of sync or sounds a bit too perfect. But it just makes these films sort of hyper theatrical, and I love that. I really like it.
The epic score as well in a lot of these movies.
Yeah, fabulous score, isn't it? By the great John Barry. I love the beginning of this movie. You get a brilliant opening song, Zulu in massive flaming letters flying towards you, and then an intro by Richard Burton.
And yes. An honourable mention as well to the Natal National Park in the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa, which does a lot of the... I like movies where the nature does the work, and I think that's the case here.
Yeah, it's like a character, isn't it? The environment is a character in this movie. And talking of characters, that leads me on to another reason why I think this movie... why I enjoyed it so much, and that's because there is some fine acting in this movie. There's also some fine overacting, but there are some really solid performances.
One of my favourite characters is the Boer bush tracker, who's outlining to he's a grizzled old sort, isn't he? Yeah. And he draws his lines in the dirt, scratches in the dirt, doesn't he, and says, "The classic attack of the Zulu is in the shape of a bull buffalo." The head, the horns, and the loins. First you go to the head, but then it becomes the loins. And then the horns close in. And then you're completely f***ed. Or words to that effect.
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed it. Yeah. He's a great character. He's, actually, that is another good point in this movie, that this is a siege movie, as much as it is, I think, a Western movie, but the Native Americans are Zulus. It's a great siege film because there's a 5-minute sequence where everything is explained to you. About half an hour into the film, you understand that there's 7 officers, 36 wounded, 97 fit for duty, 14 native levies versus 4,000 Zulus. And then, as you said, your mate, the Boer, guy, he draws out the battle plan, and the British officer draws out a little plan of Rorke's drift. So within 5 minutes, you know exactly what the stakes are and exactly the space of it. And I love that about this movie, that the whole time you're completely aware of where you are and what's going on. I was thinking of other siege movies like Troy or Kingdom of Heaven or things like that. You can't really imagine a whole city being sieged. In this film, it's very easy to the scale is just right.
Just wanting to add on the character, I mean, there's some great characters. I'm sure we'll get on to some of the great main characters, but I do think amongst the characters, one of my favourite things about this movie is some ridiculously subservient Tommies. The dying redcoat. Can I undo my tunic buttons now, sir? Permission to die, sir. Thank you, Corporal.
One of my favourites is the cook.
Oh yeah.
So we're getting on to favourite performances, but the cook at one point says, "Does he know how hard it is to make soup for 100 people, sir, in this flaming heat?
Yeah.
Does he, sir, Mr. Dawson, sir?" Fantastic. Yeah, I do love that. It's the kind of campiness. Again, I was talking about the theatricality of 60s movies. There's kind of some fantastic camp overacting in this. So how did you get on, Bryce, with this movie? Well, what are your thoughts historically and about the film itself?
This movie should be called What Are We Doing Here? Disraeli and the ruling Tory party of the time didn't really know what Britain was doing. They didn't want war with the Zulus. Gladstone, on the other side of the house, and the Liberals actually supported the Zulus' right to defend themselves. Private Hook, the best character, if you ask me, basically says, "What are we doing here? I never seen a Zulu walking down the city road." Lieutenant Chard, again, in the "What are we doing here" spirit, "I came here to build a bridge." The Boer, "What are you English doing here?" I could go on. What are they doing there? That was what it should be called. So what were the British doing there? Well, of course, the whole Anglo-Zulu War was kicked off largely by British colonial administrator Bartle Frere, who manufactured a dispute with Zululand in order to provoke them into war. And why did they want to go to war? Well, essentially because they wanted good, subservient black labour for the mines and the sugar plantations. So, contrary to the impression the film creates, it's of course the Zulus who are defending themselves, not the other way round. Britain is trying to consolidate its holdings in southern Africa. And of course, as we know, Rorke's drift is this engagement follows a major defeat up the road in Island Luana beforehand. And the war eventually won by Britain results in the partition of Zululand with catastrophic humanitarian consequences. So I go back to my preferred title, What Are We Doing Here?
Yes, as far as I understand it, looking at the history, it was a war to secure a large pool of cheap labour for British sugar plantations and diamond mines and the like, which is completely not talked about in this film.
How terribly noble.
But is that a problem? Is that a problem that the film doesn't mention? I mean, they could have mentioned it. Coming back to 60s movies, this is a classic 60s movies introduction, which I love. The voice of God narration from Richard Burton to set the scene, which is completely old-fashioned, but it works very well to quickly let you know where you are, let you know what's going on. They obviously didn't want to give the historical background. Should they have done, or is it fine that this film doesn't have that?
Well, nobody likes to be, finger wagged, patronised in a terribly woke manner. But of course, there is a crushing lack of context here, isn't there? It's a difficult one. I think when we look at the movies, I mean, I'll get on to why I think a lot of people like this movie for some slightly darker reasons in a second. But I think probably one of the things to note is that just the examples I've mentioned there, the sort of "what are we doing here" message does come across quite a lot. It's perhaps too early to be an anti-war movie in the sort of Vietnam era tradition. But you look at the team behind it. Stanley Baker is Producer actor is left wing. He's a socialist. Cy Endfield, who directs it, I believe, is blacklisted in McCarthy era USA. So he's a goddamn pinko for starters.
An American as well, which is very important maybe for the balance of this film. Michael Caine saying that only an American could cast him as an upper class character.
Works though, doesn't it?
It does very well. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that a problem? Right. Well, okay. I'll get. I mean, look. I'll be frank here. Why do a lot of people like this movie? I think quite a lot of people like this movie because it involves killing a lot of black people en masse. Now that might, seem a little bit cynical or whatever, but this is made at a time of decolonization, and it's essentially the empire striking back. That's not really the message of the movie. The message of the movie is a lot more subtle and nuanced than that. But I think the reason why a lot of people like it, I think there is. I think it'd be remiss of us not to say that it does appeal to a racist demographic, and there are. So many mini racisms within the movie. I mean, it's of its time. What it's depicting is Rorke's Drift was first celebrated by the writer H. Rider Haggard, who wrote King Solomon's Mines. Again, whose work is very dated in its description of non-whites. There's so much stuff here that there's so many sort of mini racisms. We start off with many women with their boobs out, but does that matter? No. This is. I think this film fluctuates between a U and a PG. It's okay because they're black tribeswomen. Would that be okay if they're white women? Clearly not. There's so. I mean, even the line where they're looking at the Zulus singing Stanley Baker, can't the Welsh do any better than that? And your man says, well, they have a very good bass section, but no top tenors, that's for sure. Well, no high voices, because the implication there, these are low-voiced ape-like savages lacking sophisticated Western musical capabilities. Maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into that, but even the Swedish virginal missionary daughter who has to be protected against the black hordes, that's another classic racist trope there. Rorke's Drift, did it take an Irishman to give his name to a rotten, stinking middle of nowhere hellhole like this? So many little mini racisms throughout this movie. Would it make me get hung up on this movie and discard it as a piece of racism that should never be shown on terrestrial TV again? Absolutely not. I think it's a really, really good film. However, I do come back to the point that for a lot of quite brainless people, one of the reasons I'm sure that they like this movie is because you see a lot of black guys getting shot.
Do you think that's a lot of people in the 60s, do you mean, or a lot of people today, or both? Do you think it's a lot of people?
Both.
I don't think a lot of people like this movie. I would say maybe some people like this movie because there's just piles of dead black people and a lot of parts of it, which is actually quite, particularly that end sequence where they retreat to the redoubt is for, I think this is, yes, as you mentioned, a U or a PG. It's actually quite strikingly graphically violent, that bit. But do you think it's a lot of people these days or just some people? I would say it's just some people.
I think it's, I mean, look, a lot of, the audience is complicated. This is released in the 60s, like I said, a time of decolonization. This is a heroic imperial episode, and it appeals to many people's nostalgia about the British Empire, which doesn't automatically connote racism, but of course the British Empire was a fundamentally racist endeavour, and I do, I don't want to come across again here as a sort of a finger wagging academic, but I do think, I'm not saying all, I'm not saying even most, but I do stand by the point that many people at the time and today, and I'm not talking about sophisticated people, like this movie because it involves killing a lot of black guys. I mean, I do genuinely believe that. I mean, I'm not saying the film is at that level. The film is so much better than that. But why does it appeal? Why is it so resoundingly popular is probably my question. And if something is so popular, you've got to look at some of the reasons why. It's like the great Irish comic series Father Ted. I realised a few years ago that quite a lot of people like that. Because they don't get it. They think it's just depicting thick Irish people. They don't get the humour. They don't get the this sort of zany, brilliant sense of humour to it. And you've got to, I think, acknowledge like the lowest common denominator here. And I do stand by that. That some people like seeing black guys get killed en masse.
Well, I would say that this movie did very well. It's regarded pretty highly. Budget of 1.7 million in 1963 when it was made, so you have to adjust that for inflation. Box office 8 million. Total Film magazine ranked it as the 37th best British film ever in 2004, and of course it made Michael Caine's career. But I mean, I think there's a lot to like in this movie as a movie. As I've said, that some of the performance, I think it's really well cast. Brilliant performances. I looked at the list of films that, is it Cy Endfield, the director? I'd never heard of him before. I don't know many of his movies that he's directed before or after this, but I love some of the shots in this. There's when they think the cavalry column is coming to help them, to relieve them, and then they ride off. There's a great shot that sweeps along the barricades, and then it goes up on a crane and then comes back across, and it's got people all the way perfectly. It's, again, wouldn't make any sense in reality, very theatrical, but people perfectly placed, perfect screen blocking to see all of these people. And there's some fantastic shots. The last couple of shots in the movie when Richard Burton is reading the list of VCs. So I'm just saying that you may well be right about the racism, and we're quite right to bring it up, but there are other reasons to love this movie, which I know you're not disagreeing with, but I wanted to bring that up again. Would you say then, Bryce, this movie is guilty of turning an unprovoked hostile invasion into an underdog story?
Well, I would say yes, because I think you mentioned at the start Westerns. I think this movie needs to be seen in the Western tradition, and like the best Westerns, it manages somehow, very, very successfully, to elicit sympathy for a bunch of white men against the darker skinned hordes, when really you should be on the side of the hordes. I mean, look, if I could quote the eminent Irish folk group, the Wolf Tones, come out, you black and tans, which well, Get Out Your Black and Tans was recorded by the Wolf Tones in 1972. It was actually written by Dominic Behan. Nobody knows when, late 50s, early 60s. I've got an inkling it might have been written at the time this movie comes out, because if you look at the lyrics, and this song, for those who are unfamiliar with the oeuvre of the Wolf Tones, is a critique of, it's all about the hollow victories of British imperialism. And the lyrics go, and I quote, "Come tell us how you slew them old Arabs 2 by 2, like the Zulus they had spears and bows and arrows. How bravely you faced one with your 16-pounder gun, and you frightened them poor natives to the marrow." That's the point, that you are. That's why it's a great movie, because it's, like I say, like a Western. It's managing to elicit sympathy with essentially the baddies. It's like that famous sketch on the British comic show Mitchell and Webb, where you have the German soldiers. I think they're SS soldiers in World War II.
I know the one,
with the Totenkopf skull and crossbones on their hats, and he's, one turns to the other and says, "Hans, are we the baddies?" I think that a little bit of critical self-reflection for some on the history of this movie would be no bad thing, as to who actually constitutes the baddie. Yeah,
it reminds me another scene in Blackadder, I think, goes forth when they're talking about, I rescued you from some natives with fruit or something, carrying fruit. But
particularly sharp watermelon.
That's it, that's the one. So it's that kind of thing, yeah. Another issue maybe we should raise in this is the violence of it all. The monthly film bulletin, when it came out, said of Zulu, "A typically fashionable war film paying dutiful lip service to the futility of the slaughter while making it for thrills." So I think it's a little bit harsh, but I see the point. What does this movie glamorize? Is it glamorizing the wrong thing? I mean, when I look at this, it's like a warrior movie. It's kind of, it seems to be
300.
Yeah, exactly. It seems to be, the 300 is like the modern sort of remake of this in a modern style, but it's glamorizing the warrior spirit, the
resilience. Resilience. Which is no bad thing. And again, I don't want to sound too sort of like humorlessly woke. I agree. It's celebrating the warrior spirit. I suppose it does speak to that British penchant for heroic failure, Dunkirk, something a little bit more contemporaneous, the Charge of the Light Brigade, that kind of thing. In celebrating a stoicism and a resistance and a resilience in that warrior spirit, I have no problem with this movie.
Just thinking about it another way, apparently the relatives of the real life Private Hook, who were, I believe actually the grandchildren, they were very old at the premiere, apparently walked out of the premiere because the depiction of their grandfather was completely historically inaccurate, by dint of the fact he was a model soldier and not this kind of tearaway
he was an exemplary
alcoholic
soldier. He was teetotal as well.
Yes, indeed. But of course, his character is obviously theatrically the classic tearaway who comes good under pressure. But he's also the kind of anti-hero of this movie, and he gives the everyday soldier maybe, or so he seems to be some outlet for some other view of this whole situation. As you said, did I ever see a Zulu walking down the city road? No, so what am I doing here? Do you think he's the hero of the piece?
Oh, I would, without a doubt, I think Hook is my hero of the piece. I think a lot of people say, is it Colour Sergeant Bourne with the big mutton chops? But I think for me, old Hookie he can be a little cruel, but he's the great hero, anti-hero of the piece for me. And that brings me back to, in line with the fact it's churned out in the 60s by who it's produced by. It's not like people who like it for seeing the bodies pile up are missing the point. It's not celebrating war, I don't think. I mean, it's interesting in terms of, if we go back like we usually do to the historical sources, the inspiration for the film came from an article by a historian called John Preble. John Preble is a staple in charity shop history sections. I'm not being bitchy now because it shows his tremendous publishing success back in the day, 60s and 70s. He wrote about Rorke's Drift. He wrote about a lot on the Jacobites, the Scottish stuff, the Highland clearances, Culloden, that kind of stuff. Preble was by no means a sort of, red, white and blue imperial kind of historian. He was very sort of critical. And I think it's a movie which is quite critical in its depiction of war, actually, in the futility of war, and I think that may be lost on some people who view this movie, but I think it's there. I mean, there are a lot of movies that pay, as this article said, lip service to how terrible war is, but then kind of exploit it for thrills. Well, I don't really think this movie does that too badly. There's obviously the chat between the two leads at the end where it's was it your first time too? It's a bit weird, but they're kind of ruining over the fact that they had to do this terrible thing. So I don't think it's really too guilty of that. So other things that I noticed. Is this the greatest sideburn movie ever made, Bryce? Sorry, it's
not. It's 716 Evans.
It's in the top 10 anyway. That's for sure. Some of the old shot, which I believe, if we're getting on to accuracies, inaccuracies, and perhaps pedantries, some of those old cyborgs could have been, and Tashes could have been even more substantial, I believe, to be more accurate. Before we started to record this, you were giving us a nice recitation of Men of Harlech. This comes up again. I think it's a really boring, pedantic point, which I don't really care about. But the fact that it's actually a Warwickshire regiment, right? Although they might have been based in Brecon at the time, there would have been a fair number of Welsh. So actually, I think all in all, it's quite an accurate movie, excepting the wristwatch. But it was not a Welsh regiment. That's what I've read. Yeah, I am drinking tea from a Harlech Castle mug that listeners will not be able to see, but Bryce, you'll see it in its resplendent glory. I was at Harlech Castle 2 months ago, and the poor people that work there, that song is piped in on repeat
24/7. But it is a great hymn. I think I did enjoy that. So some other stuff that I noticed before we move on to our list of questions. The same shot of the Zulus charging is used at least 3 times.
All right.
It is a good shot, to be fair. And once it's flipped, but it is a great shot.
I love when the Zulus start singing. What does Michael Caine say? Oh, it sounds like a choo-choo train. And then it's because it's them banging their shield. But the mesmeric sound of that song.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is terrific. Yeah, it's great. That whole scene, all those whole scenes, yeah. Are great. Zulu King Keshwayo was played by his grandson. How about that for a stat? Chief Mangosuthu Buthi Zali. I hope I've pronounced that correct. It's a pronunciation minefield. Here's a great one for you, Bryce. The Zulu extras nicknamed Michael Caine Lady because of his long blonde hair.
Well, that's a nice bit of proto-trans discussion from the 60s. That's nice. Now, coming back to the point, well, I don't. Let's not labour this point, but we could get too carried away with the idea of the nobility of the Zulus, because I think later on they've a bit of a checkered. I think that character you mentioned, actually, him or his son had a bit of a. They didn't throw their lot in with the ANC and their anti-apartheid struggle all the time. It's a bit of a checkered history, that. Well,
there's maybe a wider point to make, that this was as far as I haven't done any extensive reading in it, but as far as I know, the Zulu society was a warrior society. Sounds relatively unpleasant to live in, but that's not the point, is it? We're not trying to make the point that we don't want to make the classic racist point of, well, they deserved to be quote unquote humanized or civilized.
No, I think, to come back to, I'm going to keep dragging this back to your original point about it being a Western, and how in the Westerns you should be rooting for the Native Americans. The one of the interesting facts which is often relayed about this film, which I find endlessly fascinating, is that the Zulu extras were proving a little difficult to work with. So Baker actually screened an old Western to them. They'd never seen a movie before, allegedly. So he screened a Western to them, and then it makes more sense what's going on here, which is classic Western if you think about it. It's dripping in Western, the whole thing. And the simplicity and erroneousness of Westerns.
Yeah, simplicity is a very good point, actually. Yeah. Hugh Grant's favourite film. I don't know whether that's true. I read it on the internet. So let's move on to our questions, shall we? The first one of which... I do have another question for you, actually. I just wanted to pick your brains about how big a difference does the passing of time make on a movie like this? It was obviously that phrase, of its time. People always say of its time. But in terms of its attitudes to empire and colonialism, do you think it makes a difference that this movie, that we're sitting back watching an old movie? Another reason why I like old movies is because you get more of a historical context about when the movie itself was made. So in the 60s, as you say, the falling of the empire and so on. So does it make a difference that we're looking back on an old film of its time?
I don't think it should be. I'm a militant believer in that art need not... Sometimes it's impossible to divorce it from its social context, but it need not be viewed on those terms explicitly. And I still enjoyed watching this movie, despite being very aware, as a modern historian, who looks at colonialism and all these kind of legacies and the hideousness of aspects of that. I can still enjoy this movie. I do believe that there's a sort of I don't know. I don't know how people measure this, but that it sort of was a staple of TV listings and then disappeared in the late 90s when people started to get a bit, sort of wringing their hands about the massacre of hundreds and thousands of black people as something terribly politically incorrect. Now, I don't know. I haven't seen the stats on that. I'm not sure. I can well imagine how and why, for legitimate reasons, that this movie fell out of favour. However, as a piece of art, I can still wholeheartedly enjoy it.
Yeah. I agree. Let's move on to our questions. It might be a bit corny. It may not have happened historically, but I was going to give you a clue as to my favourite scene, but you've already quoted it. It was going to be, they've got a very good bass section, but no top tenors. But you've already taken that away from me. So I did think that the moment at which the Zulus and the Welsh sung to each other, which never happened, of course, was my most favourite scene.
Yeah, it's a good solid. Well, it's the scene of the movie, really. I do like the scenes with Hook being beastly to his ailing sergeant and being cruel. Because that sergeant, albeit he's dying, he's a bit of a stickler, isn't he? I mean, poor old Hookie's just trying to, relax.
Well, the thing we don't see is that Hookie's been putting up with that, for months before this, as he's slowly dying. Hookie's obviously mitching off doing any real soldiering by pretending he's ill. So he's got this guy in his ear 24/7 for months beforehand.
No wonder he hit the brandy.
Well, that brings us on to favourite performance then. Would it be you? Would it be James Booth for you, who played Hook?
Yeah, it would be. I think Hookie is my favourite character in this. I know, obviously, Michael Caine, introducing Michael Caine, as the start credits tell us. I really like the juxtaposition of himself and Stanley Baker, and as I said before, I love the Boer Bushman. No nonsense, mate.
Crikey,
you
mate.
Don't want to get caught on the Zulu horns. But no, I think old Hookie for me. Yeah. How about yourself?
Well, the classics would be Stanley Baker, Michael Caine, Nigel Green, that's Colour Sergeant Bourne. I think they're all brilliantly cast. Great jobs, great acting. But my favourite's actually Jack Hawkins, who plays Wit.
Oh, the cowardly missionary.
Yes, but he gets to say the line, "You're all going to die," which is, if I was an actor, that would be my favourite ever line to say. But I think he's really good in this movie. Apparently, it was one of the first, or the first movie where it was seen that he was becoming not the lead actor, but a what's the word?
Cowardly alcoholic.
Supporting.
Old missionary.
No, I meant
yeah.
Well, I meant a supporting actor, but I think he's really, really good in this.
He's great. He's a great actor.
That would be my favourite performance. But the fact we're spoiled for choice. I also a good shout out to the faces in this movie, because there are some ugly people in this movie. I think if it was remade in Hollywood now, you wouldn't get such interesting. Just some of the faces of some of the extras and some of the other characters are great. Who should do the DVD commentary? Which historical figure should do the historical commentary? Maybe
it should be British Colonial Administrator Bartle Frere, who kicked off this whole stupid enterprise in the first place. Was it worth it? Yeah, I don't know. Who do you think?
Well, I would have liked. This is all from the British side. I think we should hear it from the Zulu side. Wouldn't it be interesting to basically do the whole movie again from the Zulu side, with a voiceover at the beginning from King Keshweu or someone?
Yeah, and you could get the signing to be done by that lad what done Nelson Mandela's funeral, who just sort of made it up. That would be a good crack as well.
I think he is available. I don't think he's currently employed as a signer. What's the best companion film to watch with this one?
Let me see. What other racist movies could you put with this? Borat, Triumph of the Will. No, I'm being facetious. Carry On Up the Khyber. No, I'm being facetious. I've mentioned 300. I take your point that it's a warrior movie, but in terms of companion movie, I'm going to go for the 1941 Hollywood movie They Died with Their Boots On, right. Which is about the Battle of the Little Bighorn,
okay.
Which takes place around the same time. It's I think 3 years apart from Rorke's Drift. It's essentially this very similar story, although with a different outcome. Errol Flynn plays Custer. Anthony Quinn plays Crazy Horse, of course.
Anthony Quinn plays Crazy Horse?
Yes, well, he was always Mexican-born Anthony Quinn, of Irish descent, but Mexican birth, was always getting the darker-skinned roles, which we might get onto when we do Lawrence of Arabia, maybe. Slightly problematic, perhaps. But They Died with Their Boots On in 1941.
It's basically a reversal of this movie where the invaders are under siege, but they lose.
Yeah, and what I'm getting at here again is the wonderful power of cinema to make one elicit sympathy for the baddies.
Yeah, I also thought that, a good siege movie. There is actually a prequel to this called Zulu Dawn from the same director, made in 1979 with Burt Lancaster and Peter O'Toole. I haven't seen it. But that covers the Battle of Isandlwana. I think I've said that correctly. That's the battle that happened on the same day. I didn't realise this. That happened on the same day where they killed 1,800 British troops, and then they marched, or a section of them, 4,000 of them marched to Rorke's Drift. I didn't realise it was the same day.
Pretty heroic. Yeah.
Well, incredible endurance. Yeah, but anyway, so that's that maybe could be the. Or I thought maybe as an alternative, another siege movie. Which I enjoy for giving you a good understanding of the scale and so on, is Aliens, the sequel. So maybe something like that. Marks out of 10, Bryce?
9.
9? Wow, I only gave it an 8.5. And I thought it was bloody brilliant. So I'm glad to see. That's great. And for our Hall of Fame, what have you put in our Hall of Fame?
Well, my Hall of Fame item must be the Zulu wristwatch. Although it did elude me on latest viewing. You
could sit there for hours, pause, still framing, pausing at each shot of the Zulus to try and find it. I've put in Michael Caine's makeup box because there are honestly some moments in this film where he is caked in grease paint. It's just ridiculous.
Do you think the bit where the dying sergeant is deliriously singing Sweet Polly Parkins of Paddington Green, he's actually imagining Michael Caine in a frock?
Well, maybe. Maybe that's the sequel. A new section, the Nobel Prize for Movie Physics. I thought that, some of the fight scenes are so crap in this movie. I gave it to the injured Swiss soldier that fends off 3 Zulus with his crutches. Because so he sort of just lightly pushes them and they sort of are reeling backwards in agony. So
I hope he goes those crutches back to the NHS, because I believe that missing equipment costs annually $5 million a year to the British Health Service.
What would happen in a sequel? I think we would probably just hear more about the second invasion. This was the first invasion, as I understand, of the Anglo-Zulu War. We'd hear about the second invasion when the British came back with more than 20,000 troops and defeated the Zulus in July of the same year, 1879.
Well, I'd love to see a sequel where the Zulus don't give up the ghost. They actually press on. They win. They take Rorke's Drift. They wantonly massacre the British in the most gory detail, wipe out all these plucky Welshmen, annihilate them, exterminate the White Devils, and then wipe their arses with the Union flag. But that probably happens in the prequel. I haven't seen the prequel, so that probably happens where if you want the Redcoats to get obliterated, you could be watching that one.
Okay. There's probably quite a lot. Oh, did you get anything for Sood's Corner? Did you find any gushing reviews for this?
I did, and although I've been sort of poking a few holes in this movie, I would come back to the point that I give it 9 out of 10 because it's a brilliant movie. And
I agree. Yeah.
The Sood's Corner, I think nothing sums up the brainless, joyless nonsense of the UK's counter-terrorism initiative, Prevent. Which is prone to doling out stupid cultural verdicts with all the sort of idiocy and humourlessness of Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution, who last year, to the chagrin of Michael Caine, listed this as a film likely to trigger far-right identification. Now, I've just described, of course, how there are people who undoubtedly enjoy this movie because it's a lot of African men getting shot en masse. I'll stand by that point. Yeah. But I come back to my other point that art is separate to life, and a verdict like that, to say that this will automatically, spontaneously trigger right-wing thoughts in general audiences, is as stupid a verdict as saying reading Oscar Wilde will make you a paedophile. It's daft, it's humourless, and it is the height of Sood's Corner. And Michael Caine, I think, agrees with me on that point, because he was pretty disgusted in 2023 when they started making that point about this movie.
Oh, that's a good one. Military historians' pedantic profundities. There are quite a few historical inaccuracies. I think part of the reason why is because this film is so specific. It deals with a specific unit at a specific time. Generally, it's fairly historically accurate, but there are a lot of nitpicks that you can do, including Colour Sergeant Frank Bourne wears his chevrons on the wrong arm.
Oh, for goodness sake. Look, this... When will they stop? When will they stop? I mean, okay... In all the movies we've looked at, this is one of the most accurate.
Yeah.
If you're going to be that pedantic, I actually was on a military history forum discussing this movie, looking at some of the comments. People getting quite excited and annoyed, and I would say, and I go as far as to say angry, about the fact that in the film the wagons were upturned, whereas that was not the actual case. Well, excuse me.
How do they know that? How do they know the wagons were not upturned?
Well, as is another sort of message of this film, ours not to wonder why, with the pedantic profundities of some military history enthusiasts.
Some, yeah. Well, actually, that's a good point, because the wagons being upturning is another theatrical device used to show the entrapment of wit, isn't it? That's why they're upturned in the movie.
God won't allow him to upturn the wagon.
Yes, indeed, exactly. I actually, talking of military historians with perhaps too much time on their hands, I was in the Collins Barracks about 10 years ago in Dublin,
yeah.
Which is it's a military history museum, or it's got a lot of military stuff in it.
Yeah.
And one of the I was up in a dark corner upstairs somewhere. I think it was like a firearms exhibition. And I was looking at this old-fashioned rifle. And this curator jumped me just out of a dark corner, said, that's the Martini Henry rifle. That was the rifle that they used at Rorke's Drift. I don't know if that rifle came from Rorke's Drift. Might have done. But he then went into excruciating and worryingly pleasurable detail about the fact that this gun was a new gun, only used by the British Army for the last 4 or 5 years before Rorke's Drift. But it was the caliber of the weapon, and it was the penetrative ability of the bullets to shoot through people. So when they were shooting people at Rorke's Drift, the bullets were going through people, and under one bullet was, taking out 2 or 3 Zulus. That was the point he was making at great lengths as I was trying to get away. But there's actually a reference to that at the end. Chard says, "If it's a miracle, Colour Sergeant, it's a short chamber box Henry .45 caliber miracle." He's talking about the bullet, basically. But that was my run-in with a military historian with too much time on his hands. So that's a good one, I think, for this. Actually, on that point, Bryce, they weren't able to get enough historically authentic Martini Henry rifles, and had to use additional later Lee Enfields with a very noticeable moving bolt on the right side. Did you notice the moving bolt?
Do you know, I'm ashamed. I should renounce my status as a professional historian, because I'm ashamed to say I missed that.
Okay, and did you come up with a five-a-side football team name?
I'm afraid I didn't. No, go on. Do you have
I
something?
came up... Well, yeah, I've got 2. How's this? My first one, which I think is better, instead of... I've got Martini Henry. Like Thierry Henry instead of Martini Henry.
Yeah, okay.
And the second one, Rorke's assist.
Oh dear. Okay. Very well
so,
done. Talking about people with too much time on their hands. Jesus. Yeah. Well done. Very good.
Brilliant. Okay, so is there anything else you wanted to talk about? I've got everything ticked off on my list.
Nothing apart from to say that despite all the many issues that one may have with this movie, I really think it stands the test of time as just a brilliant piece of cinema.
I wholeheartedly agree. Thanks, Bryce. That was great fun. And we shall see you next time on the Historical Movies Podcast.